radio TV phono nut, and I think we found a movie editor program that I can muddle my way through until we can come up with something better, which hopefully won't be too much longer in the future. But with that said, if you see this video, then obviously I muddled through the program pretty good. So what we have here is a Crosley from about 1933. This receives the standard broadcast band and possibly a police band or a shortwave band. I'm not sure what frequency range that actually covers yet. This is a 6-tube AC/DC set with a tuned RF stage, so this ought to be pretty hot. It's in a nice little wooden cabinet here. Could probably stand some refinishing, but I've seen a whole lot worse. In fact, I'm probably just going to leave the cabinet alone and get the radio working. Now, I really don't have time to devote to a full restoration of the chassis, so in order to give me a little video to play with my new editing program that I found, I think we're just going to attempt to resurrect this, analyze it and resurrect it if possible, get it to the point where it'll pass gas. Now, when we use the phrase pass gas, that could be the result that's obtained after going to eat at Taco Bell, or it could be the results of a radio that's tuned in to any one of the 4 AM radio stations in my town. They're all about one and the same there. Here's the back of the radio, and I believe this is the band switch. This here is where the power cord used to be. This is actually an interlocked cord that's attached to the cabinet back, which is really surprising. I don't know of too many radios in the 30s that had that feature. That didn't really take off until the 1950s. But if we can't get the radio to work, at least we have this fun little spring we can play. I mean, yeah, I see the makings of a top 40 record with just the sounds this spring is making. Now, don't confuse this with the current brand of Chinese Crosley garbage. All that is just a shady importing company that bought the rights to use the old Crosley name to slap on modern made in China garbage. This radio here is actually a real deal USA made Powell Crosley Jr. Specimen, made in Cincinnati, Ohio to be precise. Alright, let's pull the back off and pull it apart and see if we can resurrect this son of a gun. Now, as far as Crosley consumer electronics go, I believe the original Crosley Corporation was sold to Avco in 1945, but I believe Powell Crosley Jr. remained on the board of directors until the time of his death, which I believe was sometime in the 50s, and then Avco shuttered Crosley in about 56 or 57. I believe one of the last notable radios that was made under the Crosley brand name was the hybrid book radio that contained 3 sub-miniature tubes and 2 transistors for the audio output stage. You might remember I did a video on one sometime back, and Shango also did a video on one a while back, but after about 1957 there were no more Crosley radios or TVs or record players until sometime in the 80s, and I really don't know the full story here, but I've seen the Crosley name on some televisions that were actually made by North American Philips, who also had control of the Magnavox, Philco, and Sylvania brand names. And then whatever company that uses the Crosley name today bought the rights to the name sometime in the mid to late 80s, and they've been using the name on their garbage ever since then. So that's about what I know, what I remember reading about the Crosley Corporation. And there's much more to know about the Powell Crosley Jr. Just look him up on the internet. You'll find plenty of information about him. Okay, here we are with the back cover removed, and this is the power cord interlock. That shouldn't be too hard to deal with. Just unbolt it from the back and take the plug apart and install a new power cord and put it back together again. So no digging around in the chassis trying to replace a power cord and get everything to cooperate correctly. Okay, we have the power cord thingy-madoodle disassembled, and this is simply just a matter of unsoldering this old wire and soldering a new one on it. Now, the way this back is configured, we're either going to have to solder a power cord with a plug on and go ahead and run it through the back, or we can just use a standard cord without a plug for now, install a removable plug on it, and then when we're done with the radio we can remove the plug from the wire and then run it back through this thingy-madoodle and put the back on it, which is how it would have been done originally, I feel sure. Back then most radios had detachable power plugs. They didn't have a plug that was actually molded onto the power cord itself. Okay, we're down here in the shop and I have the cord installed back on the radio, and do we dare just plug it in? Yeah, I think I will, just to see if I can get some people to wet their pants. You know, now that we have a camera that looks decent, we got to do something else that'll make people complain and get their drawers in a knot. But no, seriously, I just won't juice this with 120. I'll bring it up slowly and see how it behaves. Okay, we're plugged in, turned on at 0 volts AC. Let's watch the current. Yeah, got a little current draw there, so we know our filament string at least is good. Let's put it about right there at about the halfway mark and see what happens. Let it warm up a few minutes. Do we have any dial light action? No. Probably because it's burned out. Okay, hang on a second. Oh, did it focus itself? Yeah, I gotta get used to that, because my old camera didn't do that. Anyway, we're at about 90 volts AC input, very little current draw. Tube filament's lit, only the slightest amount of hum heard out of the speaker, so I really have my doubts that the audio output stage is even working. So we'll need to open the radio up, and that's the first place we need to start digging, that and the power supply stage. Now, based on our current draw, I don't think anything's shorted. Now, it's possible that something in the past might have shorted and blown something open. That's certainly a possibility, but now it's time to tear it all apart and see what's going on with it. And I can tell you, I'll confess, I've cheated. I've already looked into this when I first got the radio, just pulled it out and peeked at the chassis, and it hasn't been worked on in a very long time, and what has been done to it has been minimal. But I can tell this chassis is going to be a bit of a bear to work on. Okay, here's the chassis removed from the cabinet. Looks like the tube socket pins, for the most part, will be pretty easy to access. Alright, top view of the chassis. Looks like the rectifier tube, audio output tube, first audio and detector, IF, oscillator and mixer tube, and RF amplifier. Here's the underside of the chassis, and as you can see, this one's going to be a bit of a booger bear to work on as far as any repairs having been made in the past. The only one I see that stands out is this filter capacitor replacement, and they just tacked it across the old capacitor, which is a no-no, but back then that practice was fairly common. And the reason it's a no-no is because even though this capacitor may seem to be open, down the road it could short, and since electricity takes the path of least resistance, and if that old capacitor shorts, then you got problems. Here's another capacitor block here. I'm not sure if this is an electrolytic or just a standard block of paper capacitors. We'll find that out later. But right now I want to fire this thing back up and make some voltage measurements on the output and first audio tubes and see where we are in that regard, and then we'll go from there. Okay, we're feeding the radio with about 90 volts. All right, let's look at the plate. $33 volts. Now let's look at the screen grid. 32 volts. Let's look at the control grid. 0.007. Alright, let's look at the cathode. 15 volts. Well, that seems to be a bit high considering no more B plus voltage than we have. So we have plate and screen voltages. They're just not high enough, and even with 90 volts input we should have a lot more than that, I believe. Okay, I'm now looking at the plate of the detector and first audio tube, and the speaker's in the way, preventing me from getting to the underside of the socket, so I'll pull the tube out enough to where I can access the pins through on the top side here. Let's see what we have. 12 volts on the plate. Well, the good news is some voltage is getting there, but as expected, there's just not enough voltage there to cut the mustard. Well, it looks like we have a bad connection. Because I was checking voltages under here, and when I touched the filter capacitor, something came to life, as you can hear. Okay, here's this dual solar mini cap. And I think solar was out of business by about 1948, 49, 50, somewhere around in there. So that's the reason I say this was done back in the 40s sometime. Unless somebody used up some old stock parts in later years. But anyway, this is a dual 20 at 150. If that E3 is a date code, that's probably 1943, I would guess. I know radio production wasn't happening during that time, during the war years. I'm not sure about parts. Maybe so. Okay, I have a couple, or actually three 33 microfarad capacitors tacked in. And we'll let the radio warm up and see what it does. And then go from there. Alright, come on, warm up. Quit acting stupid. Well, the hum reduced, but we still have a loose connection somewhere. Well, the hum didn't completely go away. $79 volts B plus now. Well, I think this other block over here is also electrolytic, and it's probably dried out too. Okay, I went and looked up a schematic on this. There's not one shown in the most often needed books. There is one, however, on Nostalgia Air, but it's so blurry and splotchy, and it might as well not even be there. Now this is one of those deals where they're running the actual field coil for the speaker off of a separate supply line, which I believe is this capacitor over here. And then we have this big filter choke down here for the main power supply for the rest of the radio. Now what I want to know is, why is this thing humming like a son of a gun, like it has a bad filter capacitor, whenever I just replaced them? And I just checked and we have a good ground connection. So why is this thing humming like a son of a gun? The only other thing I can come up with is maybe a heater to cathode short in the output tube. Now I'm feeding this with 120 volts. Yeah, I'm tapping on the output tube. But of course, just because... Yeah, let me try to find another output tube and put in there and see if that solves the problem. Okay, we replaced the tube and got rid of the intermittent humming, but we have no audio. And checking the voltages, we have... I did a double take. I measured about 50 volts on the cathode, and when I checked between cathode and ground, we read 7 megohms. Yeah, that does say 7 megohms. Once again, I'm doing a double take, so apparently I think there should be a resistor between cathode and ground. Maybe I need to go glance at the schematic again. There normally is. And perhaps that resistor has drifted way up in value. Now where is that resistor? I really can't see it because this speaker is in the way. So am I going to have to dismount the speaker to get back there? Probably so. Okay, so this is what sometimes happens with flat blade screws. You're trying to remove them and the screwdriver slips, and you end up puncturing a otherwise good speaker cone that has lasted almost 90 years without getting damaged. Okay, here's the speaker removed. At least they give you long enough wires to move it out of the way to work on it. And that's a nice Jensen speaker here. But when we get ready to restore this thing, that speaker is going to have to come out to do this. And you can see what a rat's nest this is. Now this block here, this capacitor block here, is the cathode bypass capacitor for the output tube and the first audio tube. And I suspect these resistors here are the bypass resistors. So we'll check those and see what kind of shape they're in. It's really not looking too promising from what I'm getting right now. Alright, so let's see how they are. Okay, using the ohm meter to find out what's what here, instead of trying to trace this, I have one end of the ohm meter clipped to the cathode terminal on the tube, and then we simply touch our other lead of the ohm meter to what I think is the cathode bias resistor, and there it is, 0 ohms, and it's one of those flex resistors. And then when I read down here to ground, I'm reading 5 megohms, and I bet I'm reading across that old leaky capacitor more than I am this resistor, but this resistor is open. I probably need to go glance at the schematic again to get the correct value, but 150 sounds about right based on the usual design of these types of radios. Okay, this other cathode bias resistor for the first audio tube is reading 17K. I need to go glance at the schematic and check on that too, because I'm not so sure about this color coding scheme here. Back when this was made, they really still weren't quite out of the 1920s yet, so as far as design goes, and some things hadn't really been standardized on. I mean, that looks like red to me, but it could actually be brown. It's changed colors over the years, so we just need to go look up the proper schematic on this and just see what it has to say about it. Okay, I went and glanced at the schematic, and according to that, 750 ohms for the cathode bias resistor for the output tube, so I was a little off on that. 2.7 k ohms for the bias resistor for the cathode of the first audio tube, and it was reading what, 17K, so both of those have gone up in value. Or this one's open, you might say. This one here has gone way up in value, so let's dig around and see what we can find in the way of some resistors and then go from there. Oh, so maybe my schematic was wrong about something. Here's the resistor off of the, I suppose off of the cathode of the first audio tube, or maybe I screwed up, but this is a 15K resistor and it's reading within tolerance, so this resistor's fine. So I'm gonna put it back in circuit and be done with it. Okay, I have some parts tacked in here. Can I even see this? Alright, 16 volts on the cathode, that's much better. Plate voltage 102, I think, and 113 on the screen grid. What about the control grid voltage? 0.06. What about when I touch the grid cap of the first audio and detector tube? Alright, I'm getting a little audio pass through, so it's not working great, but it's working. And how about that? We now have stations.
Punish him in some way, shape, or form. What is that? Woj just tweeted that the NBA has launched an investigation.
Well, how about that?
I actually talked about this earlier. Jason brought up the point of, whether the NBA would investigate. I thought that they would have when this came out 2 weeks ago. Like, I thought that it would start at that point. If
now we're connected to the outdoor antenna, and this is wide open, but
the NBA start at that point until, and not wait until a story is released before.
It's not that great, but that's we're at a good point so far.
Just came out, Doug, as you were talking.
Alright, we're getting some distant reception, so that tells me the front end's working pretty good. It's the audio, I think, is still a bit lacking. And this tuning condenser, I'm going to have to do something with that. It's not, I'm having to turn it here to get it to move.
Not just one time, but every chance we get. That's especially important when it comes to alcohol. It's to COVID-19. NFL said, no, you're not vaccinated.
We still have a loose connection here somewhere.
Rogers is a who's out there as far as, okay, what's going on with it?
Is that WDIA? Sure sounds like WDIA. And what time is it in the afternoon? I don't know, about what, 4 o'clock or so? Better get it off of that. We might get some copyright crap with that.
You entertain Dan Patrick, Alan Cowher,
Doug Gottlieb of our every jet. Grady Quick, Jonas Knox.
Chris Broussard, Rob Parker, Jason Smith, Mike Harvey.
No, I haven't missed a call. Just tell me what time it is. It's 4:30.
They work for you.
So that's pretty good. 4:30 in the afternoon, and I'm getting some distant stations already.
Today on Fox, Zach Wilson and the Jets battled Carson Wentz and the Colts on Thursday Night Football. The action kicks off at 7:30 Eastern on Fox, and the people who are in sports.
All right, I'm getting a little bit of positive voltage on this control grid.
And I don't know enough about
0.3 volts. I mean, that's not nearly as bad as what I've seen on some sets in the past, but we probably want to go ahead and get rid of that coupling capacitor while we're at this. And the grid bias resistor is supposed to be 500K. Let's check that and see what it reads. So we'll just switch this over to ohms and check between control grid and ground and see what we read here. We read 15, 20 k ohms and rising. So I bet we're measuring back through a leaky coupling capacitor that's acting like a resistor. Okay, now we're up to, we finally made it up to 500K. There you go. So the resistor's fine, but I think that coupling capacitor probably needs to go. And I've noticed on this particular chassis there's a lot of 2-in-1 capacitors here, as in this one here. You got 2 capacitors in one casing, and the strap here is the ground. So when you run I've noticed that a lot on 30s Crosley radios, so you want to remember that whenever you work on one of these. Okay, I have the grid end of the capacitor disconnected, and let's see what we get. Four volts, 3 volts DC, and there should be nothing. And that is a dual capacitor, 2-in-1, so I'm just going to find out where the plate is on this tube and just run a capacitor from point A to point B and just snip this end off. So, where is the plate on this tube here? Is it conveniently located? Probably not.
Limited in practice today.
Okay, there's that capacitor replaced.
Lamb did not practice today. So that's a big play.
And it's doing pretty good. Now, I'm almost at a stopping point on this because, like I said before, this is a resurrection, not a restoration, and I think we've resurrected this thing enough to where it's playing. So I'm going to fix that little hole in the speaker, and then we're going to put it back together, and that's probably going to be about it. When the time comes to properly restore this thing, we're going to have to clean this whole workbench off and have nothing on my workbench but essential equipment in this radio, because this is something that's going to require a lot of room, and it's going to require my full and undivided attention. This is not going to be a quick 2-hour project. This is going to require a good bit of work.
quarterback in the middle of the season. Put my double secret probation, slap the wrist. Are you vaccinated? No, it's too late. I mean, so we're all like, wow, that's pretty nice. Good shot. How can you not be romantic?
Makes a model at one
Okay,
location, and that's Boharon.
I just clipped loose the across the line capacitor. Sometimes you'll have modulation hum without it, sometimes you won't. But for now it's just clipped loose because that's one of the prime things that could short and blow up. This electrolytic, only one section was dead, so I just simply left the 2 sections that still work in place and replaced the dead section with a new capacitor. And then there was a bypass capacitor across the 2 sections for the actual radio circuitry, so I just went ahead and changed that.
You can bring whatever you want, whenever.
And it's going to about do it. Now, like I said, this is a resurrection. This is not a restoration. One day when I have the time to devote to it, and when this bench is 100% clean, we'll pull it back apart and do this correctly. But right now, I'm not worried about that. The goal was to get it to play somewhat well, and we have done that. And now I'm trying to get all of the dried grease out of the bearings here. This is one of those tuning condensers where you turn the smaller outer shaft here, the inner shaft would be more accurate. And it turns the condenser slower to make it easier to tune. And then of course this bigger shaft, which is nothing's attached to that as far as any outer tuning adjustment. I could turn the bigger shaft and the tuning condenser would rotate, but the little shaft, nothing would happen. And you see all the old gunk coming out of there, dripping out of there whenever I hose it down with my contact cleaner. And it's better now, but it still has a ways to go. Okay, we have a tuner freed up and working. Now just to recap what we did to resurrect this thing. Obviously we had to replace the power cord, it was missing. And then we had to replace it was obvious the filter capacitor was bad, that was a given. As far as the one somebody tacked in, the original capacitor, it seems that only one section is open, so for now I just bypassed it with a capacitor there. Then we had to replace the Type 43 output tube because it was intermittently shorting and causing hum that mimicked a bad filter capacitor. And then we had to replace the plate to grid coupling capacitor between the first audio and the output tube. Had a little positive voltage on one end of that. The cathode bias resistor for the audio output tube was wide open, so we replaced that and the associated electrolytic bypass capacitor for that tube and the bypass capacitor for the first audio tube. And then there's another bypass cap between the two sections of the filter cap, and my battery's running dead. And I just went ahead and replaced that too, since I had to be in that area anyway. Is this the proper way to do it? No, it's not. But like I said, this is a resurrection, not a restoration. And one day when we have time, we will go back in this and restore it properly. Now with that said, my battery's dead and we need to take a break from it. Yeah, we'll get some Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers before the battery goes dead. That's probably what, 1260 out of what, Baton Rouge, I think. Yeah, a lot of fools fall in love. Everybody and their brother covered that one. Well, when I was rehashing what all I had done to this, I forgot to mention what led me to my results. The output tube failure, well, I found that by just tapping on it. And when the failure mode was changing as I was tapping on the tube, and that led me to the fact that tube was internally shorting. And as far as the cathode resistor being open, I found that when I noticed an excessively high voltage on the cathode of the output tube. So there was high voltage being fed to the plate, and the tube was more or less acting like a diode, so that's what led us to that conclusion. And of course it just stands to reason that this old filter capacitor that was tacked in was bad. It's 70 plus years old, so good chance it was bad, and sure enough testing it revealed that it was wide open.
The Babylon Bee. This is satire.
And then of course I replaced the grid coupling capacitor, that because there was a little bit of positive DC voltage on the grid side, and that's a no-no. Yeah, that's 670 WYLS coming in faintly, which is impressive because that station usually doesn't come in at all anymore. I've got the lights off to cut down on some of the interference.
Under oath to the FBI.
Tell people the truth of what's going on.
There's a distant station out of Jackson, Mississippi, I think.
Sirloin tip roast. Download their app. Order in a pound. Secondly, you go through this whole thing. I mean, it makes your head explode, because what's not being covered in the mainstream media is that it confirms what we've suspected all along.
Considering no more than I've done to this radio, it's doing pretty good.
The Clinton campaign orchestrated.
Now, like I said, I need to come down here one day when I'm caught up and had this bench cleaned off and can devote however much time I need to devote to this radio, go through it, and I think this thing will be a really good performing radio. I mean, I haven't even aligned this thing, and I'm not going to do that until the very end. And it's already picking up distant stations. And another thing I need to do, you notice this tuning condenser mounting is loose. There's probably some rubber grommets there that have deteriorated and need to be replaced, but that will take place whenever we overhaul this thing. Alright, here it is back together. And I just realized when I put it back together, the off-on switch is shorted in the on position. So that will be something else we need to address whenever we go back into this. Now, let me reiterate for about the 10th time, this is not a restoration. This is a resurrection. But the sad part is, I've seen some old radios passed off as having been restored that had less done to them than what I did to this one. I guess it all goes back to whatever your definition of restored is and what your morals are. Now, in my mind, when you sell a radio that's supposedly been restored for $200, then I expect it to have been totally gone through, not just enough done to make it play on the strongest local radio station. But I guess if your meaning of restored is restoring the radio to where it will pick up a station, then I guess you've accomplished your mission. But when I restore one, I want it to be performing at its peak and be as reliable as it can.
6 gigs of data for just $30 a month. Because Pure Talk is simply smarter wireless.
President Biden has declared war on the small business owners of America. In his first 100 days, he's pushed for a massive tax increase on small businesses. And his $2 trillion infrastructure plan is a $2 trillion tax hike on American employees.
See, when I turn it off, we are still drawing current, so that switch is definitely stuck in the on position.
The great folks at Job Creators Network, and they're looking for a few good men and women to join their small business advocacy and advisor program.
This radio reminds me of a Crosley tombstone that a guy brought me to fix whenever I was in my late teens, and he was one of those tightwad types. He said, yeah, this radio belonged to my uncle or father or grandfather or whoever, and it still plays, but it's got a loud background hum, and I want to get it fixed and pass it on to my daughter. And I'm thinking, well, there's a good chance your daughter probably couldn't give 2 cents for that, about that radio, but whatever. So he said, how much will it cost to get rid of the hum? And I said, well, the hum is caused by a bad filter capacitor. But I said, given the age of the radio, it really needs to be gone through and all of the paper capacitors replaced and any bad wiring replaced and any other questionable looking things dealt with. Well, how much will that cost? And I don't remember what I told him, but it wasn't all that much. Oh no, that's highway robbery. I'm not paying that. How much would it cost just to get rid of the hum? I said, well, to get rid of the hum and replace this power cord, you know, I'll charge you 20 bucks. You know, that'll cover the cost of the capacitors and the power cord and a few dollars for me. Well, he threw a fit and thought that was outrageous, but he agreed to let me do it, and he picked up the radio and I never saw him again. But in today's Sue Happy world, I don't know that I would let one out like that. You know, you fix one and then somebody takes it home and something explodes in it or catches on fire, and then they want to come back and sue you for $25 million for, you know, and it's just not worth it.
In Washington, D.C. Check out this video if you're watching on the stream at Salem News Channel or Mike Online.
Now, something I'm patching up for myself, you know, that's one thing, but something I'm doing for something else, then
Cinema are blocking
forget it.
the radical Biden agenda. The activists are howling like banshees. Look at this. Listen to this.
Blockaded Joe Montine's car, and he tried to run us over.
Our poor sounding 910.
Fitting U.S. Senate.
But they don't care. They have an FM translator, and if the truth be known, the only reason they keep the AM is so they can have the FM. You know, they don't care about the quality of the AM. Let's just keep it going so we can keep our translator. $13.90. It even sounds better than 910 and $14.50.
Spree that the Democrats want to be on. So it's okay, right? It's all right, mainstream media, huh? Detain.
All right. Well, that's about all I've got for this.
Move along.
I hope you got something out of it, and more to come later.